In the golden city of Alexandria, a boy was born, his fate entwined with the greatest empire the world had ever seen. His name was Caesarion, son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. But power is a dangerous inheritance, and his story would end in betrayal, war, and death. This is the story of the last pharaoh.
The birth of Caesarion.
In the year 47 BCE, under the warm glow of Egyptian torches, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, held her newborn son in her arms. His birth was no ordinary event. It was the merging of two ancient worlds, Egypt, the land of pharaohs, and Rome, the rising force of the Mediterranean. His name, Ptolemy 15, Philometor Caesar, was a declaration of his lineage. To the Egyptians, he was the next divine ruler. To Cleopatra, he was the key to securing her dynasty's survival. But there was a problem. His father, Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, had not publicly acknowledged him. Caesar was a man of strategy, and while he held Cleopatra in great regard, recognizing a foreign son could be seen as a political weakness in the eyes of Rome. For Cleopatra, it didn't matter. She made sure everyone knew who he was. She paraded him as her co-ruler, dressing him in the golden robes of Egypt, placing a crown upon his head, and engraving his name beside hers on the temple walls. In her eyes, Caesarion was a god, the rightful heir to Rome and Egypt alike. But Rome did not see it that way.
The relationship between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar.
To understand Caesarion's story, we must first understand his parents. Julius Caesar and Cleopatra VII were two of the most ambitious figures in history. Their affair was not just one of passion, it was one of strategy. Cleopatra, barely 21 years old, was fighting to keep her throne. Her brother husband Ptolemy XIII, a boy king, had forced her into exile. She needed an ally, and Caesar, fresh from his victory in the Roman Civil War, was the most powerful man in the world. The story of their meeting is legendary. Cleopatra, knowing she needed to impress the Roman general, is said to have had herself smuggled into Caesar's palace in a rolled-up carpet. When the fabric unfurled before him, there she was, the Queen of Egypt, draped in silk, eyes sharp with intelligence. It worked. Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne, and from their union, a child was born, Caesarion, the little Caesar. But Rome was not ready for a foreign queen, let alone a half-Egyptian heir to its most powerful leader.
Caesar's dilemma, acknowledging a son or protecting his rule.
In Rome, bloodline meant everything. The Republic was built on tradition, and Romans viewed monarchies with disdain. For a Roman general to father a child with a foreign queen was dangerous. If Caesar openly acknowledged Caesarion as his son, it would challenge everything the Republic stood for. Despite this, Caesar brought Cleopatra and her son to Rome in 46 BCE. The city was both captivated and horrified by the exotic queen and her child. Cleopatra lived in Caesar's villa across the Tiber River, a sign of his favor. But even then, he refused to formally declare Caesarion as his heir. Instead, he named his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, as his successor. Why? Some historians believe it was a calculated move. Caesar knew that his enemies in the Senate were waiting for an excuse to strike. A foreign prince with Egyptian blood would be the perfect excuse to label him a tyrant, a king in all but name. And Caesar's enemies did not need more reason to act.
The Ides of March, a turning point for Caesarion.
On March 15th, 44 BCE, history changed forever. Julius Caesar, standing in the heart of the Roman Senate, was surrounded. One by one, the knives struck. First Casca, then Brutus, then the rest. Blood stained the marble floors. Rome had rid itself of a would-be king. When the news reached Egypt, Cleopatra knew her son's future was in danger. With Caesar dead, there was no Roman protection. She returned to Alexandria, retreating into the safety of her palace, and began preparing her son for the throne. But in Rome, a new power struggle was beginning. Octavian, Mark Antony, and the remnants of Caesar's allies were battling for control. And for them, Caesarion was an inconvenient problem.
The rise of Octavian, a new enemy emerges.
Among Caesar's closest allies was Octavian, his adopted grandnephew. While Mark Antony held power in the east, Octavian was consolidating Rome under his own rule. Cleopatra had once hoped to align her son with Rome, but now a new reality set in. Caesarion was a threat to Octavian's claim to power. As the years passed, Cleopatra's influence in Egypt grew stronger. She ruled alongside Caesarion, ensuring that the boy would be seen, not just as a prince, but as a living god. Statues were built in his honor, coins were minted with his image, and across Egypt, his destiny as Pharaoh was secured. But Rome had not forgotten about him.
The stage is set for war.
The tension between Rome and Egypt would soon reach a boiling point. Mark Antony, Cleopatra's new ally and lover, was at odds with Octavian. In 32 BCE, the final confrontation began. The world was about to witness the greatest power struggle of its time, a battle that would decide the fate of Caesarion, Cleopatra, and the last independent kingdom of the ancient world.
The road to war, Rome's final gambit.
By 32 BCE, the fragile balance between Rome and Egypt had shattered. Octavian, now the unchallenged ruler of Rome's western provinces, declared war, not on Mark Antony alone, but on Cleopatra herself. The war was not framed as a battle between Roman generals. It was Rome versus Egypt, civilization versus the Eastern Queen, who had dared to challenge Roman supremacy. Cleopatra and Antony had raised a mighty fleet, an army built from the wealth of the East. At their side stood Caesarion, now 17 years old, learning the ways of war, standing as a symbol of his mother's ambitions. In Alexandria, the young pharaoh watched as the city prepared for the greatest battle of his time, but fate had already chosen its victor.
The Battle of Actium, 31 BCE.
On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the world held its breath. Off the coast of Actium, in the blue waters of western Greece, the two greatest powers of their time clashed. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was disciplined and ruthless. Antony and Cleopatra's ships, vast and adorned in Egyptian gold, were grand, but heavy and slow. As the battle raged, it became clear Octavian was winning. Then the unthinkable happened. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, saw the battle turning. Rather than face capture, she fled, and Antony, seeing her retreat, abandoned the fight to follow. The fleet crumbled. Rome had won. In Egypt, the news arrived like a funeral shroud. The grand army that was meant to defend Caesarion's rule had vanished in a single day. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, knowing the end was near.
The death of Mark Antony.
Mark Antony was a soldier, a warrior who had once stood beside Julius Caesar in battle. But now, his world had collapsed. As Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, Cleopatra locked herself within her palace, weaving plans, seeking any way to salvage the kingdom. Antony, broken by defeat and betrayal, fell on his own sword. According to legend, as he lay dying, he was brought to Cleopatra's chambers. With his last breath, he told her to make peace with Octavian, but Cleopatra had no intention of surrender. She had one last hope: Caesarion.
A mother's final gamble.
Cleopatra knew that Octavian would never allow her son to live. He was the last blood heir of Julius Caesar, a living challenge to Rome's new ruler. Desperate, she devised a final plan: send Caesarion away. She instructed her most loyal advisors to take the young pharaoh south, down the Nile, away from Alexandria, away from Rome's reach. If he could escape to India or the Nubian kingdoms, he might yet survive. The young king, barely understanding the depth of the danger, left Alexandria, moving swiftly through the desert lands of Upper Egypt. But Octavian was already watching.
The end of the last pharaoh.
With Antony dead, Octavian marched into Alexandria, claiming the city without bloodshed. Cleopatra, realizing there was no escape, took her own life, choosing death over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a captive. With her gone, Octavian turned his attention to the boy. History is unclear on how Caesarion was captured. Some say he was betrayed by his own advisors. Others claim Octavian lured him back with the false promise of peace. What is certain is that by 30 BCE, the last pharaoh of Egypt was in Roman hands. Octavian, now the uncontested master of Rome, uttered the chilling words, "Too many Caesars is one too many." Shortly after, Caesarion was executed. With his death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt, once the land of pharaohs and gods, became just another province of Rome.
Legacy, the forgotten son of Caesar.
The story of Caesarion is one of what could have been. He was the son of one of history's greatest generals, the last hope of an ancient kingdom, a boy raised to rule, yet never given the chance. His name was erased from history. His statues were torn down. Rome made sure that Caesarion would be forgotten. And yet centuries later, his story still lingers in the whispers of time. The tale of the last pharaoh, the son of Caesar, and the boy who was born to rule an empire, but died in its shadow.
The sun sets over Alexandria, casting golden light over the city's empty palaces. The last embers of Egypt's royal line have faded. The age of the pharaohs is over. And in the distance, the banners of Rome rise above the great library, signaling the dawn of a new world.